Ethan stares at the grainy VHS tape playing before him, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. On the screen, a boy is screaming in the dark, his fists pounding against the walls, his voice raw with desperation. The camera shifts, and Ethan sees it, a mirror. But the reflection doesn't show the same empty room. It shows another child. A twin. One trapped in darkness, begging to be let out. The other, standing perfectly still, watching. Ethan's stomach twists as the horrifying realization sinks in. He was never the one in the dark. He was never the one forgotten. He was the one on the other side of the glass, watching it all happen. Now that you are interested in the story, let me tell it how it all happened from the beginning. Part 1, The First Letter. Hey everyone, I don't usually post here, but something happened yesterday that I can't explain. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I just need someone to tell me I'm being paranoid. But the more I think about it, the more it feels like something is wrong. Yesterday evening, I got home from work and found a letter waiting for me. No return address. Just my name written in neat, precise handwriting. I live alone, and I don't get much mail besides bills, so it already felt off. I opened it without thinking. Inside was a single sheet of paper, old and slightly yellowed, as if it had been stored away for years. The message was short, written in handwriting that felt eerily familiar, like something I'd seen a long time ago but couldn't quite place. Ethan. I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. We were separated when we were little. They told you I didn't exist, didn't they? That I was imaginary. That I was just a phase you'd grow out of. But I was real. I am real. I need to talk to you. Please don't ignore me. I've been looking for you for years. Caleb. My stomach dropped. I read the letter 3 times, but the words didn't change. Caleb. I don't have a brother. At least, I don't remember having one. I tried to laugh it off, some kind of prank. A scam. But something about the handwriting nagged at me. It felt too familiar. I spent the rest of the night digging through old photos and documents, looking for anything, any proof that I wasn't an only child. I even called my mom, feeling kind of stupid for asking. Hey, Mom, this is gonna sound weird, but I got this letter today. From someone named Caleb. He says he's my brother. That we were separated. Silence. Then, a short laugh. Forced. Ethan, you don't have a brother. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure. I think I'd remember having 2 kids. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there was something off about the way she said it, too quick, too defensive. Like she'd been expecting the question. I ended the call, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. If Caleb wasn't real, why did the handwriting feel like mine? If Caleb wasn't real, why did I dream about him last night? And if Caleb wasn't real, why did I just get another letter in the mail this morning? To be continued, Art 2, Who is Caleb? I barely slept last night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of something, someone. A boy. Same dark hair as me, same sharp nose. We were standing in a room I didn't recognize, light flickering overhead, casting long shadows. He reached for me, but before I could take his hand, I woke up gasping for air. The worst part? I felt like I knew him. And then, this morning, the second letter arrived. No return address. No postmark. Just my name, Ethan, scrawled on the front in that same too familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. You don't believe me. I get it. They made you forget. But I remember everything, and you need to start remembering, too. Go to Mom and Dad's house. Look in the attic. There's a box under the floorboards, near the far wall. Inside, you'll find the proof. I know this is scary, but you can't ignore it anymore. We were meant to be together, Ethan. And they took you away from me. Please. Just look. Caleb. I swear I felt the air shift around me as I finished reading, like the walls were closing in. This had to be a joke. A sick prank. But something in my chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. I hadn't been up to my parents' attic in years. Not since I was a kid. But suddenly, I felt like I needed to. Like something wanted me to. I called Mom again. This time, she picked up on the second ring. Hey, Ethan. Everything okay? Her voice was a little too bright, too careful. Yeah, weird question. I swallowed. Do we have any old stuff in the attic? Like, from when I was a kid? Silence. Then, a small exhale. Why? Just, curious. She hesitated, and I swear I heard her breathing quicken, just a little. There's nothing up there but junk, honey. Why are you asking? I glanced down at the letter, fingers gripping the paper tight. My gut told me to lie. No reason. Just had a dream about it. A pause. Then, she laughed, but it was strained. You always did have an overactive imagination. That unease from last night clawed its way up my spine. I told her I had to go and hung up. I didn't imagine that reaction. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and started driving. I needed to see the attic for myself. To be continued. Part 3, A Stranger's Warning. I'm starting to think I should have just ignored the letters. Pretended I never got them. Thrown them away the second they arrived. Because now, things are getting weird. This morning, I walked out to my car like usual, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, running late as always. But the second I saw my windshield, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a note tucked under the wiper. No envelope this time, just a single scrap of paper, old and yellowed, like it had been sitting in someone's pocket for years. The handwriting was rough, like it had been scrawled in a hurry. Stop looking. He remembers you. My mouth went dry. At first, I thought maybe it was another letter from Caleb, but something about this was different. The handwriting didn't match the previous letters. Those had been careful, familiar. This was jagged, almost frantic. And who the hell was he? I stood there for a minute, staring at the message, heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around the parking lot. Nothing but rows of cars, a few people walking to work. No one watching me. No one paying any attention at all. I crumpled the note and shoved it in my pocket. Maybe it was some kind of stupid prank. Maybe I was being paranoid. But the feeling stuck with me all day. By the time I got home, the unease had settled into something worse, fear. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, checking the mirrors, waiting for something I couldn't name. It felt like there were eyes on me all the way up the stairs to my apartment. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone. I double-locked my door the second I was inside. Pulled the blinds shut. Even then, the tension wouldn't leave me. And then, around midnight, I saw it. I was sitting in my living room, half dozing on the couch with the TV on, when I felt it, this pressure in the air, like the whole apartment was holding its breath. I don't know why I looked toward the window. Maybe I felt something. Maybe my subconscious knew before I did. But I looked. And there, in the darkness outside, was someone watching me. The street lamp barely lit his face, but I could make out enough. Tall. Still. Completely motionless. His head was slightly tilted, like he was studying me. A normal person would have knocked. Called out. Moved. But he just stood there. I couldn't see his eyes. I couldn't see his face clearly at all. It was like the shadows were hiding him. My breath caught in my throat, my hands gripping the arms of the couch so hard they hurt. I knew I should move, grab my phone, call someone, do something. But I couldn't. I felt frozen, like I was back in some nightmare I didn't remember. Like I'd been here before. And then. He raised his hand. Not to wave. Not to knock. Just, a slow, deliberate movement. A single finger pressed to his lips. Shoo. I scrambled off the couch so fast I nearly tripped. By the time I reached the window, he was gone. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there. Waiting. And when I woke up this morning, there was another note, slipped under my door. You were never supposed to remember. To be continued. Part 4, The Missing Years. I barely slept last night. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up gasping, my pulse hammering like I'd been running. I don't remember the dreams exactly, just flashes, cold white rooms, a voice whispering my name, the feeling of small fingers slipping out of my grasp. I spent the morning in a fog, barely able to focus on anything but the latest note. You were never supposed to remember. The words felt like they were inside my skull, pressing against something soft and fragile. And then, sometime around noon, a question hit me. How much of my childhood do I actually remember? I grabbed an old photo album from the closet and started flipping through it, my hands trembling. At first, everything seemed normal. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. Me, around 8 or 9, blowing out candles, holding presents, posing in Halloween costumes. But then I started going backwards. 7. 6. 5. And suddenly, nothing. There were almost no pictures of me before the age of 7. Just a few scattered ones, and even those felt wrong. Blurred faces. My expression stiff and distant, like I wasn't really there. And the strangest part. My parents looked different in the older photos. Not just younger, tense. Like they were forcing their smiles. Like they were afraid of something just outside the frame. A cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. I had to know more. There was only one person I could think of who might have answers, Mrs. Callahan, our old next-door neighbor. She and my mom had been close when I was a kid. She used to babysit me sometimes, back when I was how old? I grabbed my keys and drove to her house, heart pounding the whole way. She still lived in the same place, a cozy little home with wind chimes on the porch. When she opened the door, she squinted at me for a second before breaking into a warm smile. Ethan. Oh my goodness, look at you. It's been years. I tried to smile back, but my throat felt dry. Hey, Mrs. Callahan. I was hoping you could help me with something. Of course, dear. Come in, come in. She led me to the kitchen, poured me a cup of tea like I was still a kid. It smelled like cinnamon. Familiar. So, she said, settling across from me, what's on your mind? I hesitated. How do you even start a conversation like this? Do you remember me before I was 7? She blinked, her smile faltering slightly. Before you were 7? Yeah. I mean, I don't. I let out a nervous laugh. It's weird, right? I was looking through old photos, and I realized I don't really remember anything from before that age. Like, at all. Her expression changed. It was subtle, but I saw it, the way her fingers tightened around her mug. The way her shoulders went stiff, like someone had just pressed a knife between them. Ethan, her voice was quiet now, careful. Why are you asking this? I swallowed. Because I think something's missing. And I think my parents know, but they won't tell me. I got these letters, from someone named Caleb. The second I said the name, her breath hitched. And then, before I could react, she reached out and grabbed my wrist. Hard. Her nails dug into my skin, and her eyes, those warm, kind eyes, were filled with something I can only describe as terror. "You need to stop," she whispered. "Right now. Do you hear me? Stop asking questions. Stop looking." My pulse was hammering. "Mrs. Callahan, what?" "I don't know anything," she cut me off, her voice rising. "I don't know anything." She pushed back from the table so fast that her chair scraped against the tile. "You need to leave, Ethan. Now." I just stared at her, my whole body numb. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." "Go." I backed toward the door, fumbling with the handle. She wouldn't even look at me. As I stepped outside, she called out one last thing, her voice shaking. "They took him away for a reason. Don't make them take you too." I don't remember driving home. I just remember the sound of my own heartbeat, my own ragged breathing. And the thought that wouldn't stop repeating in my head. Who the hell is them? To be continued. Part 5, The Forgotten Hospital. I should have ignored the letters. I should have burned them the moment they arrived and buried any lingering curiosity beneath the weight of my own denial. But I didn't. Instead, I let them consume me, let them pull me deeper into a mystery that feels less like a puzzle and more like a noose tightening around my throat. The last letter contained a name, Blackwood Hills Asylum. I had never heard of it before, but a quick search revealed the chilling truth. It was an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town, shuttered in 1997 under vague and unsettling circumstances. There were whispers of unethical experiments, of patients who vanished from the records, of entire wings sealed off and left to rot. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase the asylum's history, to scrub its sins from existence. And yet, buried in an old newspaper article from 1995, I found something impossible. 2 unnamed children, admitted under a special psychological study, part of a memory conditioning program. That was the exact phrase from Caleb's letter, the one that told me to look where they had tried to fix us. My heart slammed against my ribs as realization set in. I didn't remember my childhood before the age of 7 because someone had made sure I wouldn't. The drive to Blackwood Hills felt endless, each mile stretching the tension inside me until I thought I might snap. The asylum loomed in the distance like a skeletal corpse, its hollow windows gaping at me, its crumbling walls exhaling decades of dust and decay. The rusted front gates were half collapsed, as if something had forced them open long ago and never bothered to close them again. My hands trembled as I stepped onto the cracked pavement, my breath turning shallow against the thick, stagnant air. Inside, the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, old rusted gurneys, and shattered glass crunching beneath my boots. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my ears like the weight of 100 unseen eyes. Faded posters still clung to the walls, their messages eerily out of place in a building that had long since been abandoned. Healing begins here, your mind is safe in our hands. But the most unsettling part was the smell. Beneath the layers of mildew and rot, there was something else, something sour and metallic, something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I wasn't just walking into an old hospital. I was stepping into a place that still remembered what had been done within its walls. The patient records wing was at the far end of the asylum, hidden behind a pair of warped double doors that barely hung onto their rusted hinges. I forced my way inside, sweeping my flashlight over the room. Rows of filing cabinets lined the space, their drawers pulled open, their contents spilled across the floor in yellowed, rotting stacks. I searched frantically, yanking open drawers, scanning names. Adams. Bennett. Carter. Dawson. And then, at the bottom of a collapsed shelf, I saw it. A single, tattered folder, covered in dust, the tab barely legible. Walker, Ethan and Caleb. My stomach dropped as I snatched it up, flipping through its fragile pages with trembling fingers. Patient names, Ethan Walker/Caleb Walker. Date of admission, March 12, 1995. Age, 5 years old. Program, Memory Conditioning Experiment, Phase 2. My breath hitched. Phase 2. What the hell did that mean? The file was disturbingly vague, no details about the procedures, no explanation for why we had been admitted. And then, at the bottom of the final page, a chilling note scrawled in neat, clinical handwriting. Subject number 2 remains resistant. Shows signs of retention beyond acceptable parameters. Further intervention required. I turned the page, desperate for more, but the rest of the file was missing. The remaining pages had been ripped out. Someone had taken them, had stolen whatever truth was left behind. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. Ethan. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat as I turned sharply, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The air felt heavier now, charged with something unseen, something watching. And then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not mine. They echoed down the hallway outside, growing closer, too measured to be the sound of an animal, too controlled to be the random settling of an old building. My body moved before my mind could catch up, my legs propelling me forward, my pulse thundering in my ears. I don't remember how I made it out of the asylum, don't remember throwing myself into my car, slamming the door shut with shaking hands. The next thing I knew, I was speeding down the empty road, the tattered folder still clutched in my lap. My breath came in ragged gasps as I forced myself to focus, to calm down. But then my phone buzzed on the seat beside me. My stomach clenched as I reached for it, already knowing I would regret looking. No sender. No subject. Just 3 words. He remembers too. Part 6, The Experiment. I spent the next 2 days locked inside my apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, trying to make sense of what I had found at Blackwood Hills. My hands shook every time I opened the file, my eyes scanning the same words over and over, as if reading them again would make them feel any less horrifying. Memory Conditioning Experiment, Phase 2. Subject number 2 remains resistant. Who the hell was subject number 2? Caleb. Me. My head ached from the sheer weight of it all. The emails hadn't stopped, either. More cryptic messages with no sender, no subject. You were never alone. They are watching. Caleb still remembers. I wanted to pretend it was some elaborate prank, that none of this was real, but the truth sat heavy in my gut. Someone had erased my childhood. Someone had taken me, taken us, and done something to our minds. And someone, something, was making sure I never uncovered the full story. I wasn't sure where to go next until the next letter arrived, slipped under my door like all the others. But this time, it wasn't from Caleb. The paper was different, the ink smudged, the handwriting erratic, like someone had written it in a hurry. If you want answers, meet me at the Riverview Diner. 10 p.m. Come alone. Burn this after reading. My stomach twisted as I reread the words. I knew it was a risk. I knew it could be a trap. But I also knew I didn't have a choice. I had to keep going. I had to know the truth. That night, I drove to the diner, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The place was nearly empty when I walked in, just a bored waitress behind the counter and an older woman sitting in the corner booth, her fingers tapping anxiously against the table. The second she looked up at me, I knew. She recognized me. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with something deeper than age, something like guilt. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask my name. She just gestured for me to sit. I was hoping you'd never come looking, she said, her voice quiet but firm. But I suppose it was only a matter of time. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat was too tight, my pulse too loud. She exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. You were part of Project Echo, Ethan. You and Caleb both. They separated you when you were 5. Split you apart to see if memories could be rewritten, if identity could be altered, if a person could be turned into something else entirely. My breath left my body like I had been punched in the gut. The words didn't feel real, and yet, they did. They explained everything. The missing memories. The nightmares. The holes in my childhood. They made you forget, she continued, her voice laced with something almost like sorrow. But Caleb never forgot. She reached into her bag and slid something across the table. A VHS tape. Old, worn, the label peeling at the edges. Watch this, she said. But be careful what you're looking for. Some things, once remembered, can't be forgotten again. I stared down at the tape, my hands unmoving, my stomach twisting with something close to dread. When I finally looked up, she was already standing. Leave town, Ethan, she whispered. Take that tape, burn it, and forget you ever saw any of this. Then she was gone, disappearing into the night like she had never been there at all. I sat frozen in that booth for what felt like hours, the weight of the tape burning against my palm. I knew I should listen to her. I knew I should walk outside, toss the tape into the nearest dumpster, and never look back. But I also knew I wouldn't. Because I needed to know. I had to know. And whatever was on that tape, whatever Caleb remembered, was waiting for me to press play. Part 7, The Tape. I hesitated for a long time before watching the tape. I sat on my couch, the VHS clutched in my hands, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the label. The ex-employee's warning echoed in my head, burn it, forget it, leave town. But I couldn't. I had come too far. The truth was finally within reach, and I wasn't about to let fear stop me now. With a deep breath, I dug out an old VCR from my closet, the kind I hadn't used in years. I dusted it off, plugged it into my TV, and slowly inserted the tape. The machine whirred to life, the static on the screen shifting and flickering before settling into a grainy image. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just a blank, white room. Then, without warning, the footage jumped, and I saw them. 2 small boys sat cross-legged on the floor, their identical faces pale, their wide eyes full of something between confusion and fear. They were dressed in plain white hospital gowns, their feet bare against the cold linoleum. My chest tightened as I watched them, an eerie familiarity creeping into my bones. It was me. And it was Caleb. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old, their small hands gripping each other tightly. But it wasn't just their identical appearances that sent chills racing down my spine, it was the way they spoke. At first, the sound was distorted, garbled like an old recording played underwater. Then it sharpened, and I heard their voices. My voice. Speaking in unison. Where is Mommy? Why is it so cold? Why won't they let us go home? The words were flat, mechanical, too synchronized to be natural. It was as if they had been trained, conditioned to speak in perfect harmony. My stomach churned. The screen flickered again, and the footage changed. The boys were no longer sitting. Now, they were standing, pressed against the far wall, their backs rigid with tension. Their hands were no longer clasped. They had been forced apart. A shadow passed across the frame, something tall, something unseen just beyond the edge of the screen. I couldn't see who or what was there, but I could hear the boys breathing, shallow, frantic, terrified. Then the voice came. Not theirs. Something older, colder, clinical. Tell me your name. The boys flinched. Their lips parted at the same time, and they whispered, Ethan. Caleb. Ethan. Caleb. Over and over, their voices overlapping, merging, losing all distinction. The screen flickered wildly, lines of static tearing through the footage, the image warping as if the tape itself was trying to reject what had been recorded. The boys' movements grew jerky, unnatural, as though something was trying to pull them apart. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the glitching stopped. In the final frame, only one boy remained. The other was gone. The remaining child stood alone in the empty white room, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, his tiny hands trembling at his sides. He turned to face the camera, to face me, and for a moment, I thought I was looking at a reflection. But then I saw the difference. His eyes. They were hollow, vacant, stripped of something vital. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but the screen cut to static before a single sound could escape. I sat frozen, my breath trapped in my lungs, my fingers digging into the armrest of my couch. The room around me felt too dark, too still, as if the weight of the past had reached through the screen and wrapped itself around my throat. One of us had been erased. One of us had been left behind. And suddenly, I knew, I had no idea which one I was. Part 8, The Voice in the Dark. I didn't sleep after watching the tape. I couldn't. The images had burned themselves into my mind, the two boys speaking in perfect unison, the way the screen flickered like reality itself was breaking apart, and most of all, the final frame. One boy standing alone. One boy gone. The question clawed at me, relentless and suffocating. Which one was I? The thought made my skin crawl, my very identity feeling like it was unraveling at the seams. I left the TV on, letting the dull hum of infomercials fill the silence, anything to drown out the creeping sensation that I was no longer alone in my apartment. But even with the sound on, I could still hear it, the faint, almost imperceptible whisper curling around the edges of my awareness. At first, I thought it was just my own thoughts, my own paranoia twisting in on itself. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A breath. A syllable. And then, finally, the unmistakable sound of my own voice, distorted and wrong. Ethan. I bolted upright, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The room was empty, the door locked, but the voice had been close, too close. I forced myself to my feet, scanning every shadow, every corner, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen, something watching. I turned toward the bathroom, drawn by an instinct I couldn't explain, a sickening dread settling deep in my stomach. As I stepped inside, my eyes locked onto the mirror, and my body went rigid. At first glance, my reflection looked normal, same tired eyes, same disheveled hair, the same haunted expression I had been wearing for days. But then, as I lifted my hand to my face, it didn't move with me. My reflection stood frozen for just a second too long before slowly catching up, like it was watching me, waiting for me to notice. My entire body broke out in cold sweat, every muscle screaming at me to move, to look away, to run. But I couldn't. I just stood there, locked in a silent stare with myself. And then, my reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. Not my smile. It was something else entirely, stretched too wide, the corners of my mouth curling up unnaturally, teeth just a little too sharp. A smile that didn't belong to me at all. My breath hitched, and before I could even think to move, the bathroom light flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled backward, crashing into the sink, my pulse roaring in my ears. When the light returned a second later, my reflection was normal again. No smile. No lag. Just my own face staring back at me, pale and terrified. But I knew what I had seen. I knew something else had been there. I scrambled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me, every instinct in my body screaming that whatever was in that mirror wasn't me. My hands were still shaking when I noticed the envelope on the floor. Another letter. My stomach twisted as I bent down, the paper feeling unnaturally cold against my fingertips. The handwriting was unmistakable, Caleb's. But this time, There was no long message, no cryptic clues. Just 4 words, scrawled in thick, jagged strokes. You are not alone. Part 9, The Face in the Window. I hadn't left my apartment all day, hadn't even drawn back the curtains. Every bone in my body told me that something was out there, something was waiting, and the moment I let my guard down, it would come inside. The letter still sat on my coffee table, its jagged words burning a hole in my brain. You are not alone. No signature, no explanation, just those 4 simple words, but they carried a weight I could feel in my teeth, in my bones, in the very walls around me. I kept telling myself that it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, that I was unraveling like a frayed rope, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth. Caleb had been here. Caleb was watching. Caleb was getting closer. When my phone buzzed, I nearly jumped out of my skin. My hands were clammy as I grabbed it, my pulse thudding against my ribs. A message from Mrs. Ellison, my neighbor across the hall. Your brother was here earlier. He was asking for you. He said he'd be back. My stomach dropped, my hands turning ice cold, because I didn't have a brother. Not one that was alive. Not one that was real. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling like I had been thrown into a nightmare that had been waiting for me my entire life. What did he look like? I typed back, my fingers trembling so badly I had to delete and rewrite the message twice. The response came almost immediately. Like you, dear. Exactly like you. Same face, same voice. But his eyes, they didn't look right. And he smiled the whole time. Never blinked. Just smiled. I stopped breathing. The apartment felt too small, too still, like the walls were pressing inward, like something was waiting just beyond my vision, just beyond the thin veil of normalcy that had kept me safe for all these years. I needed proof. I needed to see it for myself, to know that I wasn't losing my mind, that this wasn't just some terrible trick of exhaustion and paranoia. I grabbed my keys and practically ran down to the security office in the lobby, my heart hammering with every step. The guard barely looked up when I walked in, just nodded and pulled up the footage, already knowing what I was going to ask. Your neighbor freaked out about it, he muttered, clicking through the timestamps. Said some guy was standing outside, staring up at your window for almost an hour. You got a weird family, man. I barely heard him. My entire focus was locked on the grainy screen in front of me. The footage flickered, black and white security cam footage of the building's entrance, the timestamp rolling slowly forward. And then, there he was. A figure standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the street lamp. Still. Silent. Watching. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I didn't need to. I already knew what I was looking at. It was me. The guard whistled low under his breath. Shit, man, he looks just like you. I mean, exactly like you. I could barely breathe. The figure on the screen didn't shift, didn't fidget, didn't move like a normal person. He just stood there, body rigid, his head tilted ever so slightly, like he was listening for something. Then, as if he could feel me watching him through the screen, he turned his head. The moment his face caught the dim glow of the streetlight, my blood turned to ice. The same eyes. The same mouth. My face, copied perfectly. But something was wrong. His features looked stretched, too smooth, like skin that had been pulled too tight over something that wasn't quite human. And the worst part? He was smiling. The same unnatural, wide-lipped grin I had seen in my reflection just the night before. I could feel the sweat on my back, cold and clammy, my body locked in place as the footage continued to roll. Then, without warning, the screen glitched. Just for a second, just a flicker of static. But when it cleared, he was gone. No movement. No walking away. No turning. Just, vanished. The guard muttered something, but I wasn't listening. My pulse thundered in my ears, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles ached. I could feel something staring at me, even now. Caleb wasn't just watching. Caleb was waiting. And this time, I didn't think he was going to leave. Part 10, Reversed Memories. The seizure hit me like a lightning strike straight to the skull. 1 second, I was standing in my apartment, heart hammering, mind tangled in the impossible knot of what I had just seen on the security footage. The next, I was on the floor, convulsing, drowning in my own body. My muscles clenched and twisted like something inside me was trying to break free, my vision flickering like a dying light bulb. There was pain, sharp and sudden, and then, nothing. Just darkness. Just silence. A great, yawning void that stretched endlessly in every direction, swallowing me whole. And somewhere inside that emptiness, there was a voice. Not mine. Not Caleb's. Something else. Something older. Something that had been waiting. It whispered my name, no, not my name. Caleb. When I woke up, the world was too bright, the air too sterile, the rhythmic beeping of machines drilling into my skull like a hammer against glass. My throat was dry, my limbs were heavy, and the second I tried to move, a sharp, electric pain lanced through my skull. A hospital. I was in a hospital. The ceiling was white, the kind of blank, soul-sucking white that felt designed to erase people, to make them nothing but patients, but I wasn't supposed to be here. My fingers twitched against the stiff bedsheets, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. And then, the door opened, and a man in a white coat stepped inside, his eyes scanning a clipboard, his face passive, professional. "Mr. Walker," he said, without looking up. "Caleb, can you hear me?" The world tilted sideways. I felt the breath punch out of my lungs, my pulse roaring in my ears. Caleb. He had called me Caleb. My mouth opened, but nothing came out, my brain stalling like an engine struggling to turn over. "No," I rasped, my throat raw, like I had swallowed broken glass. "No, my name is Ethan." The doctor finally looked at me, his brow furrowing, his head tilting just slightly, like I was some fascinating specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Walker, you've experienced significant disorientation due to your seizure. But I can assure you, your name is Caleb Walker." He said it so calmly, so absolutely, like there was nothing strange about it at all. Like reality hadn't just turned itself inside out. Panic surged through me, wild and unchecked. "Check my wallet," I snapped, my fingers already reaching for the bedside table, where my belongings should have been. "Check my ID." The doctor sighed, setting his clipboard down on the counter. "We already did, Mr. Walker. Your identification lists your name as Caleb. Your medical records. Your bank account. Everything." The room swayed, my vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't happening. This wasn't real. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning, my fingers clawing at the 4 taped to my arm. "That's impossible," I choked out. "You have the wrong file. Someone made a mistake." The doctor didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply stepped aside and handed me my wallet, my hands shaking as I flipped it open. The breath left my body in a sharp, violent exhale. My ID was there, my picture, my face, staring back at me, but the name printed across the card wasn't Ethan. It was Caleb Walker. My heart pounded against my ribs, my fingers curling around the plastic like I could crush it, like I could force it to tell me the truth. My name wasn't Caleb. It had never been Caleb. I wasn't him. But the world, the very fabric of reality, had shifted like quicksand beneath my feet, and suddenly, Ethan Walker no longer existed. Part 11, The Asylum's Secret Room. I drove back to Blackwood Hills in the dead of night, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The hospital had swallowed my past whole, buried it under layers of rot and dust, but I wasn't leaving without answers this time. Not after what they had done to me. Not after they had erased me. I had nothing left, not my name, not my apartment, not even a trace of my old life. I had checked everything before I left. My bank account? Gone. My lease? Non-existent. It was as if Ethan Walker had never lived, as if he had been a shadow flickering at the edges of existence before being snuffed out completely. But I still had one thing. Caleb's letters. And they had led me here. To this place. To the very spot where my memories had been cut open and stitched back together into something unnatural. The asylum stood like a corpse against the sky, the windows black, empty sockets staring down at me. The wind howled through the broken doorways, whispering through the shattered remains of a place that had once called itself a hospital. I climbed through a side window, the glass long gone, the frame curling with rust. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something old and sour, something that had seeped into the walls like a sickness. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the abandoned corridors, the beam slicing through the dust-heavy air. I wasn't supposed to be here. Every instinct in my body screamed it, every nerve in my skin prickled with the knowledge that I was walking straight into something I wouldn't be able to unsee. But I kept going. I had to. I wasn't leaving without the truth. The door was hidden behind a row of rusted filing cabinets, barely visible under layers of peeling wallpaper. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't even locked. It was just there, waiting. My breath hitched as I pressed my fingers against the wood, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I hesitated, just for a moment, before pushing it open. The room beyond was wrong. The air was heavier, thick with something that made my stomach churn, like I had just stepped inside a mausoleum filled with ghosts too angry to rest. The walls were lined with photographs. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Some curled with age, others so fresh they looked like they had been printed yesterday. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The photos were of children. Young boys, maybe 4, maybe 5. Twins. Some smiling, some staring blankly, their faces eerily familiar. My fingers trembled as I reached out, tracing the edge of one of the images, my stomach twisting into knots so tight I thought I might be sick. And then, I saw it. My face. Not once. Twice. 2 identical boys, standing side by side, their dark eyes staring straight through me, their small hands gripping each other's wrists like they were the only things keeping each other tethered to this world. The photo was old, edges yellowed, but I knew. I knew. This was me. This was Caleb. This was us. My body locked, every muscle coiled with something between terror and understanding, something so massive it made my skull feel like it might crack open. I turned, my breath ragged, the weight of the room pressing against me. The walls weren't just covered in photos. They were covered in names. Some crossed out. Some scratched so deep into the plaster that the letters bled together. My gaze darted across them, my pulse roaring in my ears. Caleb Walker. Ethan Walker. Caleb Walker. Ethan Walker. Over and over again, written and rewritten, as if someone had been trying to decide which one was real. And then I heard it. A whisper. Ethan. But this time, it wasn't inside my head. It was coming from behind me. Part 12, The Mirror Experiment. The whisper froze me in place. It curled through the air like breath on a cold morning, soft but wrong, too close, too familiar. My own name, spoken not by me, not by anyone I could see, but by something just behind me. My skin crawled as I turned, expecting to see the impossible, expecting to see him. But there was nothing. Just the walls lined with those terrible, endless photographs. Just the names, scrawled over and over again like a desperate prayer to something that didn't care. My breath came fast, uneven. I forced myself to move, forced myself to push forward, even as every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. There was something else in this place, something hidden beneath the rot and the dust and the half-remembered ghosts of a childhood I had never really lived. The answers were here. I could feel them pressing against me, just beyond my reach. The corridor ahead was narrow, the air thick, the walls too close together. My flashlight flickered, struggling to cut through the dark, and for a brief, terrible moment, I thought I saw movement. Not in front of me. Not in the open air. Inside the walls. A shadow shifting where there shouldn't have been one, a shape stretching and curling just beneath the cracked paint. My pulse pounded. The hallway ended at a single metal door, unmarked, dented, rusted at the edges. It looked different from the others, stronger, like it had been meant to keep something in. The handle was stiff, but when I turned it, the door gave way with a soft, reluctant groan, swinging inward into complete, suffocating darkness. My flashlight's beam barely touched the corners of the room beyond, but I saw enough. A chair. A desk. A mirror. And on the far wall, the thing that made my stomach turn inside out, a single, small bed. I stepped inside, the stale air clinging to my skin like something alive. The mirror took up almost the entire length of the wall, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, the glass dull with dust and age. But I knew what this was. Even before I reached out, even before I pressed my palm flat against the cold, unyielding surface, I knew. It wasn't a mirror at all. It was a window. A two-way pane of glass, hiding another room, another space, another prison. My fingers trembled as I wiped away a layer of dust, peering through the surface, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. The room beyond was identical to the one I was standing in, down to the last detail, the desk, the chair, the bed. But this one was wrong. The walls were streaked with something dark, something that had been smeared there by small hands. The bed frame was broken, twisted at an angle, the mattress shredded. And carved into the walls, deep into the concrete, were the same two names I had seen outside. Ethan Walker. Caleb Walker. Ethan Walker. Caleb Walker. And then, in the dust-covered glass, something moved. A shape, a flicker of motion just beyond my reflection. My breath caught in my throat, my whole body locking up as I saw it. A shadow in the other room. A figure, small, hunched, curled into the farthest corner of the opposite space. My mouth went dry. My stomach twisted. I felt something deep, something instinctive, something I had felt as a child but had long since forgotten. A presence. I was never alone. Not then. Not ever. I had been on one side of the glass, living my life, laughing, sleeping, breathing. And on the other side, Caleb had been watching. In the dark. In the silence. In the prison they had built for him. They had kept us apart, separated us, conditioned us. They had tried to turn one of us into something else. And the worst part? The most terrifying truth. I didn't know which side of the glass I had been on. I didn't know if I had been the one looking in, or the one looking out. Part 13, Caleb's Return. I should have run. I should have turned and fled, left that godforsaken place behind, burned every letter, every trace of Caleb, every flicker of memory clawing its way back to the surface. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something deeper than fear kept me rooted in place, something older than instinct, something that had been stitched into my bones long before I ever understood what fear was. The air in the room had changed. It was no longer just stale or thick with rot, it was alive, humming with a presence I could feel just beneath my skin, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. And then, the lights flickered. Just once. Just enough to send shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, their edges rippling like something submerged beneath black water. And that was when I saw him. Not in the mirror. Not in some half-remembered dream. He was here. Caleb stood in the doorway, his head tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle, the dim, flickering light slicing across his face in ways that made him look more like a cracked photograph than a person. I knew it was him. I knew it the way I knew my own reflection. Same sharp cheekbones. Same dark hair. Same deep-set eyes. But the eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too hollow. Too deep, like they had no end. His smile was slow, creeping across his face like a crack splitting open in glass. And when he moved, my stomach twisted violently, because something about the way he stepped forward wasn't right. His limbs seemed to lag for just a fraction of a second, his body catching up to itself in a way that made me want to be sick. "You look different," Caleb murmured, and his voice wasn't quite right either. It was layered, overlapping itself, like more than one version of him was speaking at once. "Not like I remember. But that's what they do, isn't it? They change us. They break us apart and stitch us back together. Over and over and over again." He took another step, the floor groaning beneath him, and I stumbled back, my pulse slamming against my ribs. "I thought you would remember more by now," he continued, his expression shifting in the dim light, his features flickering. One second, he looked like me. The next, he looked, stretched, distorted, something else barely holding its shape. "But you still don't, do you?" His head tilted farther, so far that I swore I heard the vertebrae crack. "That's why I had to come back. To finish what they started." My mouth was dry. My lungs felt like they had collapsed inside my chest. "What did they do to us?" I forced out, the words feeling like splinters in my throat. Caleb let out a soft, breathy laugh that didn't sound human. "Oh, Ethan," he whispered. "They never did anything to me." He took another step forward, and for a split second, the flickering light cut right through him. His body stuttered, glitched, like a corrupted file struggling to hold itself together. "You are the experiment now." The words sank into my brain like a needle piercing flesh, sharp, deliberate, unshakable. And in that moment, in the dark, suffocating silence between us, I knew. I had never escaped. I had never been free. I was still in the experiment. And Caleb was the one running it. Part 14, The Truth About Ethan. The world tilted. My stomach twisted into knots so tight they felt like they might strangle me from the inside. The walls of the asylum pulsed, warping in and out of focus like I was trapped in a dream that was trying to wake up. But I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't hallucinating. The truth had been creeping toward me this whole time, whispering its name in the dark, scratching at the corners of my mind like an animal trying to dig its way free. I was not Ethan Walker. I was never Ethan Walker. Caleb watched me, head still tilted at that unnatural, snapping angle, a smile stretching across his face like something carved into stone. He didn't need to say it. I knew. I could feel it unraveling inside me, something deep in my chest breaking apart like old, splintering wood. I had spent my whole life thinking I was the real one, the original, the only version of me that had ever existed. But that was a lie. A carefully constructed, meticulously placed lie. I had never been the first. I had been made. Grown. Built from memory and shadow, piece by piece, every thought, every habit, every childhood moment stitched into me like a puppet designed to dance to someone else's tune. The foundation hadn't erased my memories. They had given me false ones. "You were never supposed to find me," Caleb murmured, his voice soft but filled with something vast, something ancient, something like pity. That was the whole point, wasn't it? A perfect experiment. A perfect test. He took another step forward, the dim light flickering across his skin. It wasn't flickering anymore. I was. My hands trembled as I lifted them in front of me, and I saw it, the blur. The edges of my fingers weren't sharp, weren't solid. They wavered, stuttered, glitched. Like I was a signal breaking apart, a broadcast losing connection. Panic surged through me, raw and electric, crashing through my chest like lightning. I wasn't stable. The realization hit me so hard I nearly fell to my knees. I wasn't a person. I was a construct. A living, breathing experiment. And now, the seams were coming undone. They wanted to see if it would work, Caleb continued, watching me with that too dark stare. Could they take a person and break them apart? Could they create something perfect, something that believed it was real? Could they tear out the soul and replace it with a manufactured one? He exhaled softly, stepping closer until he was barely a foot away. And the answer, Ethan, he let my name linger, let it sink into my skin, let it twist like a knife inside my gut. Is yes. It worked. You worked. They made you, and you believed it. Every second of your life, every memory, every thought. You lived it all like it was yours. His voice dropped lower, almost gentle. But it wasn't. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to fight back against the impossibility of it. But the truth was unraveling inside me like a reel of film catching fire, melting away everything I had ever known, everything I had ever been. I wasn't Ethan Walker. I was the test. The copy. The imitation. And the real Ethan, the one who had been forgotten, erased, buried beneath years of experiments, was standing right in front of me. Caleb. The name that had haunted me, chased me, dragged me back to this place wasn't the name of a long-lost twin. It was my name. I had been chasing myself, chasing the ghost of the original. But now, standing in the cold, rotting shell of the asylum, staring into the eyes of the real thing, I realized something else. They hadn't just created me. They had abandoned me. Part 15, the last letter. The tape played, and I was trapped. Not just in this room, not just in my shaking, sweating body, but in the truth that was clawing its way up from the pit of my mind, ripping through every lie, every false memory, every carefully placed illusion that had kept me safe. The screen flickered violently, static bleeding into the image like something was fighting to be seen. Then, the darkness. A room with no doors, no windows, no light except for the pale, flickering glow of the camera itself. And there, a figure. A boy, no more than 5 or 6, his body curled into the farthest corner of the room, his fingers raw and bloody from clawing at the walls. He was screaming. His voice was shredded, his throat ruined from how many times he had begged to be let out. And then, as if my own bones had turned to ice, I realized what I was looking at. I was staring at my own face. But not me. Not this version of me. The first one. The real one. Ethan. The camera jolted, the angle shifting just enough to reveal something worse. A mirror. A wide, unbroken pane of glass, stretching from the floor to the ceiling, reflecting a room that wasn't empty. And standing behind the glass, watching the child scream and cry and pound his fists into the walls, was me. Or at least, the version of me I had always thought I was. My breath caught in my throat, my entire body locking up like my muscles had been frozen in place. I had never been in the dark. I had been on the other side of the glass. Watching. Waiting. I wasn't Ethan. I had never been Ethan. I had been the replacement, the shadow of a life that was never mine, a creature built from Caleb's grief and the Foundation's obsession with playing God. The screen glitched, the screaming distorting into something hollow, something mechanical, and then, for a fraction of a second, the footage froze, a final frame of the child curled into himself, whispering one last, trembling plea. Please, I just want to go home. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember how I got back to my apartment, how my shaking hands found my keys, how my body even knew how to move after something inside me had been shattered beyond repair. But when I stepped into my home, or what had once been my home, I felt it instantly. The presence. The weight of something waiting. The air was heavy, charged, thick with the stench of something old, something rotten. And then, at my feet, I saw it. A letter. The envelope was sealed, my name scrawled across the front in a hand I knew too well. My own handwriting. My stomach twisted as I bent down, my fingers brushing against the paper, my pulse roaring in my ears. I knew what it would say before I even opened it. I knew. But I tore the envelope anyway, my breath shallow, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the page. 4 words. No explanation. No warning. Just a quiet, taunting confirmation of what had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface of my false life. Do you remember now? Thank you for watching this story to the end. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with new stories. I also look forward to your comments, criticisms and suggestions below this video.